On this episode of Hot Rod Hoarders, we're diving deep into the drag racing history books to show you what's largely considered the world's first funny car. This is Jack Chrisman's Mercury Comet. We're taking an in-depth look at how it was built, how it was raced in the 1960s, and how it was restored and preserved by Jim Barillero. Stick around to hear this historic drag car run on a heavy load of nitromethane. Before I get too carried away, I want to encourage you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and feel free to leave a comment down below. Going back to the early days of drag racing, the cars that got the most attention on the track were the dragsters, the modified roadsters, the things that had been cut up and turned into purpose-built race cars. Now, there were plenty of stock appearing cars on the track, but the real attention getters were these really wild combinations where you could see the engine, you could see a lot of things going on, you could see the modifications that people had made. So for years, the dragsters and the roadsters and the altereds, those were really the top dogs of drag racing. A man by the name of Jack Chrisman was one of the pioneers of dragster racing, and he raced all through the 1950s and ultimately ended up driving for Mickey Thompson. He was a well-known driver that won lots of races, but in 1963, Jack encountered a rear-end breakage that injured him pretty severely. Even though Jack was hospitalized and had a long road to recovery, he stayed in the drag racing community, and he got a job with the NHRA selling advertising for the National Dragster magazine. Now, this allowed him to make some really great relationships with people in the automotive industry. One of those relationships was with Fran Hernandez. Now, he was in charge of the Ford drag racing team, and he was responsible for putting together some awesome packages that raced in super stock and a new class called Factory Experimental. Factory Experimental was broken into 3 divisions, A, B, and C, based on the weight of the car and the cubic inches of the car. So it was split up sort of how the gas classes and the altered classes were split up, whereas Superstock was split up by the advertised shipping weight of the car against the advertised horsepower of the car. So this really allowed the factories to get involved and experiment, hence the name, with different engine combinations. So in the case of Ford and Mercury, they were putting big 427 cubic inch engines into small and mid-sized cars like the Mercury Comet. This class really kicked off in 1962, but evolved very, very quickly. And by 1964, there was a new rule in place that allowed a 2% wheelbase alteration. And the Chrysler boys immediately took advantage of that and started moving their wheels around to try to help the weight bias on the car and get more weight on the rear end so that the car would hook up and go. Meanwhile, the Fords and Mercurys had similar struggles, but the weight bias was naturally a little bit better. It was a little shorter wheelbase car. These factory-prepared cars had the absolute best equipment that Ford had to offer, and they had some additional components that were installed by Bill Strop at Strop & Associates. He was a factory-backed chassis builder. He built cars and trucks and race vehicles for lots of different applications, and he was the guy responsible for these Mercury Comets. These cars got 427 cubic inch engines, fiberglass body components, they got suspension tricks, they got the whole 9 yards to make these things work on the drag strip. So back to the relationship between Jack Chrisman and Fran Hernandez. They got to talking, and Fran wanted to offer Jack an AFX Mercury Comet. And Jack wasn't a huge fan of the idea because he had come from top fuel drag racing, the top of the sport, the fastest, the quickest, the loudest, and he didn't have a lot of interest in racing a stock appearing car. But he decided to go ahead and take the offer, and he went and picked up his Mercury Comet from Sachs & Sons Lincoln Mercury in Downey, California. So even though Jack wasn't really interested in driving this stock appearing full-bodied car, he was interested in winning. So he got Bill Shrewsbury to drive the car for him, and they competed in AFX class for a few months during the 1964 season. Even though the car and driver were very successful in the AFX division, Jack still wasn't really happy with the performance of this car. He wasn't happy with the wow factor and the fanfare involved. So around this time, Jack caught wind of the Dodge Chargers, which was a special exhibition team. It was 2 cars that would race side by side that had blown and injected engines, not on nitromethane, they ran on gasoline, but they were pretty wild combinations, similar to the blown gassers and the blown altereds, but in a pretty much stock appearing modern car. By the middle of the 1964 season, the Dodge Chargers exhibition team had kind of fizzled out. They had broken some pieces that they couldn't replace, and it was the perfect time to debut Jack's wild creation. He got the idea to build something outside of the AFX class designation, but he still wanted it to be somewhat of a factory-appearing car to appeal to Sachs & Sons Lincoln Mercury, who was willing to give him a second factory-prepared Mercury Comet. The second Comet went back to Bill Stropp for additional modifications, and then Jack Chrisman put together a special engine and driveline combination that was unlike anything anybody had ever seen. Now, he was taking some cues from the Dodge Chargers exhibition team by having a blown and injected engine inside of a full-bodied car, but he was turning it up about 10 more notches by adding nitromethane to the tank. And he's also using a direct drive system just like what he would have used in the dragster. So this was a true combination of top fuel dragster in a factory-appearing car. It was something that hadn't been done before, and by most people's definition, it was the very first funny car. Jack Chrisman's supercharged Cyclone made its public debut on July the 12th, 1964 at Fremont Drag Strip in California. The car ran in the tens at 148 miles per hour, smoking the tires most of the way down the track, and then its huge debut, where it got a bunch of notoriety, was at the 1964 NHRA Nationals in Indianapolis. Any car running any type of exotic fuel other than gasoline had to be classified as a fuel dragster, and that's exactly what happened with the Jack Chrisman car. It ended up being placed in B fuel dragster. After Jack pretty much blew everybody's mind at the Nationals, other people started building cars similar in nature. Now, not all of them had superchargers, not all of them had nitromethane in the tank, not all of them were exactly like this, but it really inspired a lot of creative builds. Some of them had altered wheelbase, some of them had really wild engine setback. There was really no set of rules that applied to this type of car. And things only got weirder at the 1965 AHRA Winter Nationals, which is held in January at Beeline Dragway in Arizona. This is the first big race of the year. It's not an NHRA race, but it's still very big, and it saw the introduction of the wildly altered wheelbase Mopars. So Dick Landy and a couple other cars showed up at Beeline with this drastically altered wheelbase, like a stretched out nose, the rear wheels pushed way forward with a ton of overhang on the back. And it's understood that that's where the term funny car came from, is these drastically altered wheelbase cars. They just looked a little bit funny, and that's the name that the announcer came up with, and it's the name that stuck for all these years. Now, to be fair, these altered wheelbase Mopars did not have nitromethane in the tank. They did not have superchargers initially. Later on in the 1965 season, superchargers came into play, maybe a little bit of nitromethane came into play. So to answer the question, do I think that the Chrisman Comet is the first funny car? My answer is yes, because it is the first car to run with nitromethane fuel. That's a vital part of funny car racing. Even with the altered wheelbase and the name funny car coming from the altered wheelbase cars, I still think that Jack Chrisman set the tone of this there are no rules mentality where you just build what you want to build, and it stuck. The funny car name stuck from the altered wheelbase guys, and the idea of putting nitromethane, blown, wild combinations inside of a car, that stuck from the Chrisman angle. So, altogether, the answer from my vantage point is yes, the Chrisman Comet is the first funny car, and that things changed drastically after it debuted in 1964. According to my research, the last time this car was seen in the 1964 configuration was in February of 1965. That's here at Pomona, California at the Winter Nationals. It doesn't get much better than this picture right here. You can see a really tight shot on this car. The back tires are just absolutely smoking like crazy. And you can see those butterflies in the Enderley injector hat. They are wide open. And this thing is making a pass. This is pretty early on in the run, and you can just see that this thing has no traction whatsoever. And as it made its way down the track, it would eventually gain enough traction to really motor on down the quarter mile. But for the most part, the wow factor of this car was that insane launch where this thing would just make all the noise you could imagine, white smoke coming off the tires, and just a wild ride every time that he laid down on the throttle. The original configuration rolled on a set of American Racing magnesium torque thrust wheels. Somewhere in between the 1964 and 1965 season, Jack picked up a sponsorship from Krager. So you'll see these pictures from the 1965 Winter Nationals in Pomona. The car has a set of Krager wheels on it instead of the Americans, and you'll see a little bit of extra lettering on the quarter panel signifying that Krager sponsorship. Jack could see some evolution happening with these full-bodied cars with nitromethane, big engines, altered wheelbase. He could see those changes happening, so he took this opportunity to tear the car down, send it back to Bill Stropp again to be completely rebuilt and set up for the new season. Number one on the long list of upgrades this car was going to receive was the brand new single overhead cam Ford engine. This is 427 cubic inches, giant cylinder heads, the best technology that Ford had to offer, and one of the challenges was going to be fitting it in between those stock shock towers. So a solution for this problem was setting the engine way back. Setting it back 25% of the car's wheelbase allowed him plenty of room in the engine bay. In fact, the front of the engine where the blower pulleys are is about where the factory firewall would be. In an effort to save weight, they actually cut the whole front end of this car off and replaced all of that clunky front suspension stuff with a Woody Gilmore dragster style front axle. And it actually had a transverse leaf spring that was adjustable, where you could adjust the ride height to whatever you wanted it to be. They had all sorts of tricks in this front suspension to help transfer weight to the rear end, and it was an ideal setup for 1965. It's got tons of weight reduction inside and out, and as a part of this rebuild, it included changing this from a 1964 Mercury Comet to a 1965 Mercury Comet. You got to remember, at the time, these factory-backed cars, it was pretty important to stay relevant and to stay new, because the whole idea of win on Sunday, sell on Monday, that was still in effect. So winning with a year-old car didn't seem very exciting, especially for Sachs and Sons dealership. That was not what they wanted. So in addition to the body change, the engine change, the chassis changes, this thing got a brand new paint job. Instead of the plain white with lettering, now it's candy apple red with gold leaf lettering. This thing is a top-notch machine, and it's ready to hit the track in June of 1965 at the Spring Nationals in Bristol, Tennessee, just 4 months after it had been raced at the Winter Nationals. Moving on to the 1965 NHRA Nationals in Indianapolis, you'll see that the candy apple red paint job has actually started to fade already, and you'll also notice a patch job on the lower portion of the doors where the Sachs and Son dealership is no longer mentioned on the side of the car. And by the end of the 1965 season, this car already appeared to be outdated, even though there still wasn't a specific class in NHRA racing for this type of car. These cars were evolving so quickly that nobody seemed to be able to keep up. When one guy debuted a new car, it inspired new ideas, and these things just snowballed out of control. And by the end of the 1965 season, there was an idea from Ford and Mercury that was really going to make a statement in this new style of racing. The idea came in the form of a single-piece flip-top body that resembled a factory-produced body. And underneath that would be a ladder-style tubular frame with a full roll cage, suspension, and of course, one of Ford's 427 single overhead cam engines. Just a handful of these cars were produced, and they were fully factory-backed. Once again, Fran Hernandez stepped in there and made some pretty big things happen with this organization. So these fiberglass bodies were put together, Logie Stamping put together the chassis, and they created some pretty impactful cars. Now, during this time, Jack Chrisman was one of the men who was chosen for one of those cars, and instead of a factory-appearing body, he chose to whack the top off of this Mercury Comet and make a roadster. Now, this was a crowd-pleasing car, and it was a very fast car. Ultimately, though, the car suffered a pretty major fire and burnt to the ground, and that left Jack without a car to drive. So he called up D. Keaton, who's the guy he sold the 65 Mercury Comet to. He called him up and asked him if he could borrow the car. And he did exactly that and finished out the 1966 season with his old car. Once again, this thing is very outdated, especially when you consider the sophistication of a tube chassis, flip-top body, engine setback, all of those things that were going on with the Logie built cars. His old faithful 65 Comet still went out there and was competitive. In these pictures from 1966, you can see that the paint job has been changed on the 65 Comet. It's got a fresh red paint job on it. It's got some fresh lettering. It's got Comet on the door instead of Sachs & Sons. And you'll notice in some of these other pictures that the Jack Chrisman lettering has been moved to the door, and Kendall has been added to the quarter panel, as that was one of Jack's big sponsors. After the 1966 season was complete, Jack sent the car back with D. Keaton, and Jack had a new car, another factory back Mercury, this time a full-bodied, flip-top, one-piece fiberglass car with a Logie chassis, 427 Camry on nitromethane, another crowd-pleasing, record-breaking car. Kendall carried on its sponsorship into the 1967 season, and Jack continued to dominate with this car. He continued tweaking the setup. He really nailed down the handling of that Logie chassis, and he was out there winning races on a pretty regular basis with this car. It also got lots of attention from the magazines. This car was on the cover of several magazines, had many features written about it. This car continued the evolution of funny car racing. So in a matter of 3 years, Jack Chrisman went from running low 10s in a stock appearing 64 Comet to running into the 7-second zone with this one-piece fiberglass flip-top car. And throughout this time period, tire technology was changing at a very quick pace. So we went from pie crust, hard slicks, slicks that didn't have a special compound, slicks that didn't have a flexible sidewall. We went from that to what we now consider the wrinkle wall slick. This was a tire that had a specific sidewall, a specific tread compound that allowed these cars to go much quicker and much faster. So, you know, in the days of the tire smoking Chrisman Comet of 1964, yeah, that car was only running low 10s. That was not changing the world by any means. But just a couple years later, the cars were running in the 7s. And part of it was horsepower, part of it was weight balance and weight bias, and a big part of it was tire technology that took these really wild and crazy cars and made them insanely fast, almost put them into the same category as dragsters. So going back to those early days with the stock appearing Mercury Comet, one of the guys that was really impressed by this machine was Jim Barillero. Now, I've talked about him in a previous video and we showcased some of his collection, but what really was impactful to him was this Ford single overhead cam engine. And he ultimately built a few of these engines for his own projects, and it came in handy around 1983 when he had the opportunity to buy the original Jack Chrisman Comet. I don't know the full details, but here's a classifieds listing from the September 8th, 1973 issue of Drag News, where the Chrisman Comet is listed, just the body it says, a fiberglass body, for $300. Now, I don't know if this is legitimately the 1965 car because it actually had a steel roof and quarters, or if this is maybe the 67 body, which did later come up for sale in the 1980s. I'm not sure which car this is, but still pretty interesting that Jim Barillero had saved this clipping from so many years ago. Fast forward to the early 80s, and Jim Barillero is talking to his friend Rick Kirk, who's a fellow Ford fanatic, and Rick happened to mention that he knew that the original Chrisman Comet was up for sale, and Rick helped Jim get in touch with the owner. Jim haggled with the owner over the phone for over a month, and they finally agreed on a price of $5,000. And Jim hopped in his F-350 ramp truck with his buddy John Marshall, and they drove 2.5 days straight, switching out driving duties to get to Alberta, Canada, to buy this historic car. It was 2,700 miles each way. He knew the moment that he saw it that it was the Jack Chrisman car. He had no doubt about it. Every detail was exactly how he remembered it from back in the day. But some things have been changed. The car had 5-lug wheels on it instead of the spindle mount Halibrands. It had some magnesium ETs on the back, which were extremely rare, not authentic to the car, but rare nonetheless. And the car didn't have a camera in it anymore. It had a wedge-headed 427. It had some good parts, but the biggest reason for buying this car was to preserve this car's history. And Jim Barillaro went to great efforts to go buy this car, then disassemble it and restore it to the way it was in 1965. So once Jim got his hands on this car, he started contacting old school drag racers who played a role in the buildup of this car back in the 60s. He reached out to Jack Chrisman, who was happy to provide him any details that he wanted about the buildup of this car and how he should go about rebuilding it. And Jack actually found him the original clutch can, the clutch setup, and the drive unit. Remember, this car did not have a transmission. It just had a direct drive unit, and he found all of those parts for him and shipped him all those parts to Connecticut so he could put this car back to 100% original. However, Jim actually wanted to go out and race this car, so instead of using the original aluminum clutch can, he used a Lakewood bell housing. So as part of this process, he ended up selling the ET wheels, and he kept the 5-spoke front runners and just put them over in his stash of parts for future projects. And by all of our research, we have determined that these are the original wheels and tires that were on the 1964 version of the car. And crazy enough, these things still exist. They're sitting on the front of Jim Barillaro's Ford Model A sedan, which happens to be his first car ever, and his 2 sons are rebuilding this car right now. So Jim rebuilt this car to the best of his ability. He put candy apple red, 30 coats of lacquer on this car, true gold leaf lettering. So he wanted to go to nostalgia races and other drag races and be able to make legitimate passes in this car. So in an effort to do that, he added some roll cage bars to be a little safer. He added a fire suppression system. You know, he updated this car to 1980s standards, and he took it all over the country, putting on a show with tires smoking burnouts, some pretty fast passes. Of course, it wasn't turned up quite as high as it used to be back in the 60s, but still making big time noise, putting on a big time show. The coolest thing to me about the restoration of this car is that Jim had most of the parts to this engine already in his shop. In the late 60s, he had built a Ford Torino funny car and campaigned it in the Northeast, and this thing had a 427 camera, blown on nitromethane, and he used a lot of those parts that he had left over to put this car together. Now, this car has a different style blower and different style injector hat than what he was running, so he sourced those parts and put this thing together using things that he had laying around. The Halobrand magnesium wheels that are on the 65 Comet are actually the tires and wheels that came off of Jim's Torino funny car back in the late 60s. When he sold that car, he kept the engine, the wheels and tires, and a few other parts. So he had held on to those things for all these years, and it was the perfect place to use them on this historic piece. The 1967 car, this came a little bit later in Jim's life. He found the body in California in a wrecking yard in 1987, and he brought this thing back home, and he fixed it, painted it, completely restored it, and set it over a period correct Logie style chassis. Once again, 427 camera. This one he built a little more radical than the engine that's in the 65 car. It has some more exotic parts in it. It's definitely turned up a little higher. It's got a little bit more nitromethane in it. Pulley setup is a little more aggressive. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to meet Jim and talk to him and hear these stories about these cars. But his 2 sons, Jim and Mike, they are excellent storytellers, and they're carrying on their dad's legacy. And one way that they're doing that is taking the 65 car and cranking it up and letting people hear what this thing sounds like. You know, most people haven't even seen one of these overhead cam engines before in person, and they certainly haven't heard them run. So, you know, taking this car out, showing it to people, letting people hear it, letting people know the story, and letting people hear this history, it's a pretty big deal. It's something that really carries on Jim's legacy. It also carries on Jack's legacy, because he passed away in 1989, and you know, Jack was a very influential drag racer, both in dragster racing and in funny car racing. So, you know, these cars, both of them, the 65 car and the 67 car, are really doing a lot to keep the history of this sport going. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to feature these cars. These things are tucked away inside of a shop in East Tennessee, and even though they do get out into the public sometimes, I just wanted to be able to tell their story, tell what these cars went through to get to where they're at today. I want to say another huge thanks to Jim and Mike Barillero for letting me crawl all around these cars, look inside, underneath, all over, and I just appreciate them giving me the backstory as far as their dad's involvement. They also gave me some great details as far as the full history of these cars, and of course I did my normal thing where I obsess over the details and try to find additional history and additional pictures, and I'm thankful for you guys for watching this video. Stay tuned, we're going to keep digging into the history of drag racing and showcasing some historic old cars, so stay tuned. Thank you for watching.